Another time we were playing in Atlanta, and there was a policewoman off stage while we were running through our sound check. Afterward, she motioned to me with her finger. I walked over and said, "Officer, you know you can't make me come with just one finger." I was being cocky. "Very funny," she said. Then she asked me for my autograph. "It's for my daughter," she said. "She's fascinated by your tongue. I don't understand her tastes, but what am I going to do?" "Who are you trying to fool?" I said. "It's not your daughter, it's you. You want to come and get it? I'm in room 190. Naturally, I didn't expect anything, but later that night there was a knock on the door, and the woman was standing there in her full police outfit. When she walked in, it was like a scene from a movie. She took her hat off and her long hair fell down. Then she unbuckled her belt and took off her gun. Then the scene faded to black. The next day we both came downstairs and she was dressed like a policewoman again. The guys all lined up against the wall. It was as if someone had yelled, "Spread 'em!" When I wasn't chasing girls, I was trying to keep Ace and Peter out of trouble. It took some doing, especially in Ace's case. Originally, Peter and Ace had roomed together, but after a while, they didn't get along. Peter asked me if I would mind if he roomed with Paul, and I roomed with Ace. It didn't bother me. We were all in the same band. One night I was going down to the hotel bar to see if there were any girls for the taking. I asked Ace if he wanted to come along. "Nah," he said. "You go ahead. I'll be down in a little while." I went by myself, and of course there were girls, and I started talking to them. And after a while, though, I started to wonder where Ace was. I called up to the room, and no one answered. Then I got a little worried. I got one of the hotel managers, and we went to the room and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Finally, we smashed open the door. Ace was in the bathtub, passed out, and slumped down with the water rising. His mouth was just above the water. He would have died in a minute. He smelled like a pickled herring. We pulled him out of the water naked and put him to bed. I stayed up all night to make sure he didn't roll over and fall to the ground, which he did anyway, or throw up and choke on his own vomit. By the next morning, I was exhausted. Ace wasn't. He bounded out of bed, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. "Hey," he said, "I stayed in last night and went to bed early. What did you do?" He didn't remember a single minute of the ordeal. Despite our best efforts, and we were still growing as a touring band, both in confidence and in ability, Hotter Than Hell wasn't a commercial success. The album barely made it into the top 100, and soon Neil Bogart was calling for yet another album. This time we came back to New York to record it. It was called Dressed to Kill, and Neil had decided that he would produce it with us back in New York at Electric Lady Studios. The objective for the third album was to push Kiss to a higher level. For previous albums, Neil had boosted sales with novelty singles or television appearances. This time he wanted an anthem. He told us he wanted a song like Sly and the Family Stone's "I Want to Take You Higher," something that would get the whole audience involved, screaming, pumping their fists. Paul had an unfinished song he had been working on for months, and I had a piece of a song that I hadn't finished earlier. We put the two together, and before we knew it, we had this new song, which eventually became Rock and Roll All Night. The song was simple, which was very appealing, and it had a vocal chorus that was sung by a large group of people in the studio. Not just the 4 band members, but engineers, families of people from the record label, about 20 people in all. We felt the energy of it immediately. It was like those old Slade songs that we had liked when we were just starting out, but with this very accessible Middle America feel. We had a feeling it was going to be big. For the cover of Dressed to Kill, we used a photographer named Bob Gruen, who had earned some fame for taking pictures of John Lennon and had worked with dozens of other rock stars. The original idea was to have us in full makeup on the streets of New York, but Bob thought that it might be more interesting to put us in makeup and normal business clothes. We liked the idea, but there was only one problem. None of us had normal business clothes. So we borrowed suits from people, and they weren't exactly perfect fits. If you look at the cover photo closely, you can see that my pant legs and jacket are a little too short and a little too tight. Dressed to Kill was released in March 1975, and the single of Rock and Roll All Night went to radio a week later. It wasn't the success we had hoped for. It didn't do terribly. I think it peaked at number 68, but we had really thought that it might break us into a different level of radio play, and it didn't. At the same time, we were laying the groundwork for our next album. About a week after Dressed to Kill was released, we made plans to record some live shows. There was already talk of possibly putting out a live Kiss album, because we still felt that we were a much more powerful band on stage than in the studio. We loved being on tour, and it showed. I remember 2 sisters who showed up at my hotel room door in Indianapolis in early 1975, both of whom wanted to spend the night with me. The better-looking of the 2 was noticeably pregnant. Despite that, We all stripped naked, got into the shower, and became fast friends. In another city after another show, I opened another hotel room door to find another lovely young lady. My guess was that she was 18. I always made it a point to ask the girls how old they were. It may not have been the most gentlemanly thing to ask, but my intentions were certainly honorable. She came in and quickly had her way with me, and I with her. Then there was another knock at the door, and I yelled for whoever it was to leave. My young lady friend said that I could answer the door. It was okay with her. When I opened the door, a woman was standing there, attractive and in her early 40s, who identified herself as the mother of my companion. I must have looked as if I'd seen a ghost, but the mother said there was no problem, and asked me if it was okay for her to come in and join the fun. I looked over at my young lady friend, and she just giggled and nodded her head yes. Life was good. In a Midwestern city, I can't say which, but it's on a lake, a prominent radio promotion man invited Kiss to be his guests at his home for dinner. We were told to go because we needed radio support to sell records. The dinner was uneventful and quite boring, until the promo guy got up and started making a long speech. Sitting across from me was his beautiful wife. When she brushed her high heels against me under the table, initially I thought it was accidental, and moved my leg away. I had already arranged for a guest to meet me in my hotel after dinner, and had no intention of coming on to this man's wife. She brushed up against me a second time and smiled suggestively. Then the promo guy took some of our guys on a tour of his home, and his wife quickly took me by the hand and led me to the far end of the house into a bathroom. There, she dropped to her knees and without a word showed me how fond she was of me. Some of the memories are bittersweet. When Kiss played Las Vegas for the first time, we had finished the concert and quickly made our way back to the Stardust Hotel. Standing in the lobby waiting for the elevator, Peter nudged me and whispered, "Wow, look at that girl over there." She was stunning. Long, blonde hair, short, tight miniskirt, and high heels. She smiled. I immediately reached out, grabbed her hand, and pulled her into the elevator with us. She came willingly. Neither of us said a word while the elevator went up to my floor. When we got inside my room, words didn't seem necessary. We devoured each other. Afterward, she told me her name was Star, that someday she would be a star, and that her last name was Stowe. We stayed up all night, and when morning came, and it was time to leave, she asked me what she should do. I remember saying something about sending photos of herself to Hugh Hefner. I was out of touch with her for about 6 months. Then one of our road crew showed me an issue of Playboy. The centerfold was Star Stowe. She described herself as a one-band woman and said some very nice things about me. I contacted her, and for a time, she was my companion on the road. We had terrific times. We went to movies together, we went to clubs, we ate, we danced. We couldn't keep our hands off each other. After a time, I lost touch with her. Years later, I ran into her at one of our concerts. She had been through some hard times, had not saved any money, and seemed sadder than I had ever seen her. Later on, I looked her up and was stunned to find that she had passed away. The God of Thunder, The Making of Destroyer, 1976. By 1975, Kiss had broken all the rules and records. We never had a hit single, and yet our double live album, Kiss Alive, had gone multi-platinum in an era when live albums simply didn't sell. We not only broke through with a live album, but with a double album to boot. The mystique had grown beyond even our own expectations. We had become our stage personas, the demon, the star child, and so on. Offstage, we were forced to hide our faces. Photographers were constantly trying to photograph us without makeup. There was a $25,000 price tag on my head. In some ways, we were trapped by what we had created. Initially, it was fun, but in short order, it became difficult. We couldn't go out in public without security. Bodyguards were often asking people to hand over film. Differences within the band started to come to the surface. Paul was more the classic rocker. He wanted to be a rock star, period. Ace and Peter had those notions as well, but they were never able to really verbalize just what they were all about. I wanted Kiss to be the best of all worlds. I loved comic books. I loved horror movies. I didn't have preconceived notions about rock bands and, quite honestly, didn't care. It wasn't enough to tour and be a recording artist. Somehow, Kiss should be about all these other areas as well. I may have been the impetus behind getting the band and management to start thinking about a Frank Frazetta piece of art for our forthcoming Destroyer album. Frazetta was the finest of the sci-fi fantasy painters, best known for painting all those Conan the Barbarian covers. I was a major fan. I asked the art department to reach the Frazetta estate. They contacted his wife, And then we found out the price tag. It was too much. We would need to find someone else. Ironically, we hit upon a cousin of Frazetta's, Ken Kelly, who was known to me through his creepy and eerie magazine covers. Kelly and the band met to discuss the concept. I remember suggesting we should be depicted in a Marvel Comics pose, like the Fantastic Four. So there we were, a rock and roll band, depicted on their new album without guitars. It was a major statement. We stood out from all the other bands. It said, in effect, we are more than the guitars we play. It was the pivotal point that sent a message out to millions of fans and press alike. We were also superheroes. The first version of the cover was done during the middle of the recording process. We stopped recording mid-record and went off on tour. We also decided to change the outfits. So by the time we finished Destroyer, the cover of the album depicted us wearing the wrong clothes. Ken Kelly had to go back and paint on the new costumes. Bob Ezrin was brought in to produce us. He was Canadian and had been successful with the Alice Cooper albums. Needless to say, we were fans of his work. He brought with him something we had never seen before. He had vision. He knew before the album was recorded what it should be. He rearranged songs. He co-wrote half-finished songs. He told Peter how to play his drums. He literally came up with the melody line for the entire solo of Detroit Rock City. He made Ace play every note and stick on the harmony parts. He suggested my bass line in the song. Neither Ace nor Peter was thrilled with the notion that some outsider was now telling them what to play, but the results speak for themselves. All the major decisions on the entire record, the sound loops, the children's choir, the kids on God of Thunder, Ezrin's kids, by the way, the string-based Beth, and the song order were completely Ezrin's. The car crashing at the beginning of Detroit Rock City was a sound effect Ezrin brought in. Initially, some of us thought it was a bit melodramatic. Though we knew movies used sound effects with songs, we simply never thought about using the sound of crashing cars to open a song. But while recently listening to the Shangri-La's Leader of the Pack, sure enough, I heard a motorcycle crash in the background. Beth was written by Stan Penridge mostly. It was credited to Peter Criss, Stan Penridge, and Bob Ezrin. In truth, Peter didn't play a musical instrument, drums, or a percussive instrument, and I have never seen him write a single song. Peter may have contributed a line of lyric or two, but after hearing the original Penridge demo tape of the song, it's clear who came up with the original song, which incidentally was called Beck, as in Becky. As a side note, Peter was having a hard time getting the vocal performance down. His pitch wasn't to Ezrin's satisfaction. Ezrin made the band leave the studio to give Peter a chance to concentrate. Eventually the track was done, and we all stared at each other. There were no guitars played by the band on it. There were no drums on it, and Ace never showed up to play his part. In a very real way, Beth is simply Peter singing alone. There is not another piece of Kiss on there. We didn't know if it would upset the fans. The first single was Detroit Rock City. The B-side was Beth. In those days, the other side of a single would feature another song. Usually it would be the song you would never imagine as a hit single, because you didn't want to compete with yourself for a radio airplay. Detroit Rock City was not a hit record. We were all shocked to learn that radio stations were turning the record over to play Beth. It became our biggest hit at the time. It also won the People's Choice Awards, tying, by the way, with Disco Duck. God of Thunder was written by Paul. Most people think I wrote it. It was originally recorded in a demo form at Magna Graphics Studios in New York on 8-track, with Paul singing and a disco beat. Ezrin rearranged the song, slowed it down, and suggested I sing it instead. Paul, to his credit, was very receptive. Both Paul and I would offer our songs to be sung by Ace and Peter. Paul in particular gave a few songs to Peter to sing. God of Thunder became my signature song for years. In what must have been an inspirational moment, I decided I should throw up blood during the beginning of the song so that I could look the part. Destroyer was released and initially stalled at sales of around 890,000 copies. We were on tour, and although the fans came out in droves to see their heroes, the record just stood still. Then Beth became a hit and everything around us exploded. We were invited to do the Paul Lynde Halloween special, which meant national television exposure. We appeared on the show with Margaret Hamilton, the original witch from The Wizard of Oz. We also noticed that the world had changed. All of a sudden you could walk down the street and people would be walking by wearing Kiss t-shirts. We had arrived. Ezrin's recording style was leagues beyond anything we had seen. In some ways, it seemed like a throwback to a previous era. But in other ways, it was clear he knew what he wanted and how to get it. Records are recorded by separating all the different elements into tracks. You can move a fader and only hear the guitar, or the snare drum. Once everything was recorded on a 24-track machine, you then added effects like echo or chorus and mixed it down to a stereo mix. What you hear at home is a mix. Ezrin would record 2 or 3 guitars, add effects, and submix them, which means there was no turning back. He would commit to a sound very early on. It further solidified the notion in my mind that he had a vision. Destroyer also marked the first time we tried experimentation. Peter's drum set was set up in the loading area in back of the studio for one of the tracks. His drums faced an open elevator shaft. Microphones were placed close to the drums and at the end of the elevator shaft. That way, the sound would come back like thunder. Peter was separated from the rest of us, so a video camera was set up to film him. This was still at the early stages of video, so it all seemed very science fiction to us. On one of the takes, Peter stopped playing, and when we looked up, there was a guy carrying out the garbage into the elevator nearby. Flaming Youth was probably the most difficult song to record. It was composed of a title Paul had, which he lifted from a band we had opened up for called Flaming Youth, a verse and a chorus that Ezrin, Paul, and I tossed back and forth, and a bass riff I had from an old song called Mad Dog. Ezrin put all the pieces together and then threw a bizarre time signature at us, which was torture for a basic drummer like Peter. Peter never counted bars of time. He had never done it and, in fact, didn't understand the fundamentals. Ezrin had to start from the beginning. Where was the 1 and where was the 2? And then he had to teach Peter in particular what a bar of music was, how long it lasted, and how one counted it. He also tried to crystallize what a chorus and a verse were. All this education made Peter very irritable. It was also very time-intensive. We were used to going into the studio, not thinking too much about technicalities, and just doing it. We had never encountered anything like this. Kiss was a rock and roll band. We were unschooled, self-taught musicians. We got through the song, but it had to be done in pieces and then edited together. Shout It Out Loud was written in Ezrin's apartment. Paul and I had gone over to play new material. Ezrin sat down at the piano, Paul had a guitar, and suggested a few changes. When there was a basic verse idea, I suggested shout it out loud, as in shout it, shout it, shout it out loud. This wasn't a unique idea. Wicked Lester had recorded a song we never put on the album called We Want to Shout It Out Loud, written by Cook and Greenaway. The demo was originally done by the Hollies. They never used it. We tried to record it, but it never made it to the final stages. I had always loved the notion of shouting anything, as in Shout, by the Isley Brothers. Shout It Out Loud seemed like a natural follow-up to Rock and Roll All Night, where Rock and Roll All Night proudly proclaimed I wanna as the key idea. Shout It brought the fans into the party. Well, the party's begun and you want some fun. Great Expectations was a song I had written initially about the band. The original lyric went something like, you watch Paul playing guitar, and you see what his hand can do, and you wish you were the one he was doing it to. And you watch me singing this song, and you know what my mouth can do, and you wish you were the one I was doing it to. Ezrin thought the song was too self-serving if it talked about the band, although Beth was very clearly about the band. Beth, I hear you calling, but I can't come home right now, 'cause me and the boys will be playing all night. I would have preferred to have the band names mentioned in the song. I had fondly remembered Beatles songs and hearing, Take It, George. When Destroyer came out, Kiss became the biggest band in America. We went from opening up for other bands to headlining at Anaheim Stadium in California, with opening acts like Bob Seger, Uriah Heep, and Ted Nugent. We had billboard and television commercials. Coming soon were the Kiss makeup kits and lunchboxes. While almost every record we recorded in our 30-year history has elements I would change, in retrospect, Destroyer is an album I wouldn't change. I might do away with the sound loop at the top of the first song, but other than that, I wouldn't change a thing. Kiss has played thousands of concerts. We have added and dropped songs from our set list purely as a response to what the fans seem to like. Destroyer has stood the test of time. More than any other record we ever recorded, it probably defines what the band is and what it stood for. The songs on it, Detroit Rock City, Shout It Out Loud, God of Thunder, and others, continue to be a staple of our live shows. Rock and Roll All Night, Alive and Destroyer, 1975-1976. The relative failure of the Rock and Roll All Night single disappointed us slightly, but it didn't scare us, because we knew exactly what we had to do. We had to go right back on the road, which was where we were strongest and connected with our audience most powerfully. This time, there was an extra wrinkle. We had decided to record some of the shows and release them as a live album. We had the 3 studio albums, but we never felt as though they captured the band. They were merely documents. For the full Kiss experience, we needed to let fans have a taste of our live show. Not only the theatrical elements, but the power of the band. The recordings that would become alive were drawn from a number of concerts, including shows in New Jersey and Iowa. The majority of the album, though, was taken from a late March show at Cobo Hall in Detroit. In some ways, the decision to tape the Detroit concerts was the easiest one we ever made. A city is never just a city. It is always defined by the people who live in it and by what they do for a living, which then in a very real way affects their lifestyle. Because New York is a cosmopolitan city, it was the birthplace of Studio 54. Southern cities were more repressed in some ways and wilder in others. Detroit, being the hub of the auto industry, was anti-fashion, much more meat and potatoes. I wouldn't be surprised if McDonald's sold more hamburgers in Detroit than anywhere else. It's very blue-collar, a real middle American metropolis. The big stars that emerged out of Detroit through the late 60s and early 70s, the MC5, Ted Nugent, Bob Seger, and Grand Funk Railroad, were similar bands, loud and passionate, with minimal pretension and a bit of grittiness. Detroit is all about no-nonsense music. From our very first record, Detroit had taken us to heart immediately. People in New York and Los Angeles misread us. They affected a certain sophistication and felt that we weren't up to their standards, but Detroit understood our mix of fun and energy from the start. After the Detroit show, we were presented with an award and went to a party thrown in our honor. There was plenty of action at the party, lots of booze, music, and women. I wasn't interested in the booze. I had had my fill of music for the day, and I even had my female companion for the night, a writer from Cream magazine who was doing a feature article about the band. I was ready to leave with her when I spied the waitress moving through the crowd with a plate of brownies. My sweet tooth got the better of me, and I pounced on those suckers. I must have eaten 6 or 7 of them before I had my fill. Within 5 minutes, I became Gene in Wonderland. Immediately, my head shrank to the size of an apple. My feet ballooned to the size of boards. My hands grew bigger the longer I stared at them. I grew frightened, took the hand of my female companion, and ran out to the waiting limo. Once inside, I became very thirsty for milk. I had to have some, and within a block of the concert hall in a seedy part of Detroit, we pulled up to an all-night diner. Inside it was quiet, and there were a few people with their heads down, either eating or drinking coffee. I stepped up to the counter, thinking that my voice couldn't be heard because my vocal cords must have shrunk along with my head. I screamed at full volume, "May I have a glass of milk, please?" It scared the pants off the waitress. Everyone at the place, now startled, looked up. I was embarrassed. I thought they were all looking at how small my head had gotten. I left the diner, dove back into the car, and thanked God my female companion knew where the hotel was. She got us there, and as I was walking down the hallway, propped up by her, every step felt as though I was walking through a funhouse mirror. When we got to the door of my room, I couldn't fit my key in the lock. My key was now the size of an anvil, and the keyhole no bigger than the eye of a needle. The only saving grace that night, when we finally got into bed, was that I was finally proud of my manhood and couldn't imagine anything getting bigger. Alive almost did not come out. Casablanca had taken a bath on a record called Best Moments of The Tonight Show, a double album that consisted of highlights from Johnny Carson's talk show. Ironically enough, this record was put together by Joyce Biowitz, our former co-manager and the woman who would soon be Mrs. Neil Bogart. Even though we were the label's prize act, there wasn't a whole lot of money to go around. There have always been rumors that the Alive record was substantially reworked in the studio. It's not true. We did touch up the vocal parts and fix some of the guitar solos, but we didn't have the time or money to completely rework the recordings. What we wanted and what we got was proof of the band's rawness and power. Alive was released in September 1975 and immediately moved up the charts. Sales eventually went to 4 million. Amazingly, the Live record produced our first big single, a concert version of Rock and Roll All Night. Almost overnight, we went from being a working band with a record contract and a devoted following to being national superstars. The lasting effect of the Live album went beyond Kiss. In fact, it affected the entire rock industry. Before Alive, bands didn't really release concert albums as a legitimate product. They were almost always put out to fulfill contracts. We were one of the first bands to really care about the idea and to package it accordingly. When the album came out, it had a gatefold showing all 3 studio albums and pictures of handwritten notes from all the band members. Within 3 years, many more of these elaborate live packages appeared, including Frampton Comes Alive and Cheap Trick at Budokan. which included a little homage to us in a song called Surrender, with the lyric, "Rock and rolling got my Kiss records out." Live records became mandatory for 70s superstars, and we led the way. After the massive success of Alive, we knew that we had to deliver a grand statement. We wanted a studio record that would top all our previous efforts. To achieve that, we brought in Bob Ezrin, who was already well known as a producer for his work with Alice Cooper and would later produce Pink Floyd's The Wall. We started recording in the record plant in New York in January of '76, only 5 months after the release of Alive. Up until we met Bob Ezrin, we were leery of letting anybody else have a say as to what we should record. That included management, record companies, producers, anybody. Bob Ezrin was the first and continues to be the only producer who ever really had an effect on the band. It's hard to say why we let Bob have so much control, yet it's also easy. It wasn't about his track record. It's never about a track record. It's more about the fact that when somebody has an idea and can communicate that idea as effectively as Bob, they automatically command a certain respect. Other bands have stories about meeting up with producers who teach them how to be professionals. Before these producers came along, they were noble savages, beating on their guitars and just hoping for the best. It wasn't like that with Kiss. We had known what we were doing since the beginning. Bob didn't make us go faster. In fact, if anything, he slowed the process down considerably. But it was the way he slowed it down that was impressive. At one point, I remember him stopping us in the middle of a rehearsal. "Okay," he said, "do you guys know how to tune your instruments?" We were all self-taught musicians. We said, "Of course, here's how you tune them." He frowned. "No," he said, "there's another way to tune instruments, which is pitch perfect. It's called harmonic tuning." And he showed us how to do it, which we had never seen in our lives. It was like going back to school or to summer camp. He carried a whistle around, and whenever he wanted to get our attention, he would say, "Campers?" Every time we thought we had done enough to satisfy him, he would come at us with something else. In some ways, he was quite a disciplinarian. When he didn't think we were getting a handle on something, he would send us outside the studio. Paul and I were excited because we knew the experience was making the band better. We were rubbing our hands together thinking, "Oh boy, this is going to a place we haven't been." It was a really good adventure because we recognized that whatever we were doing, even though it was a step forward, it still sounded like Kiss, but better than before. We literally heard the record coming together there in the studio, and it was the best version of the band to that point. Much of the success of Destroyer had to do with Bob's bravery, particularly his interest in introducing new elements into our music. Bob's children would come in. He was going through a divorce at the time, and they actually wound up as the little voices in God of Thunder. He was doing all kinds of things, like having symphony orchestras and choirs. What George Martin was to the Beatles, Bob Ezrin was to us. He had something that we had never seen before in a producer, a vision. He knew where he was going within the confines of what Kiss was, and most important, he knew how to get there. While Paul and I had perspective and vision, we didn't quite know how to get there, because we were limited as musicians. There was one thing we did know, though. We wanted to create an experience that went beyond the experiences that other rock bands were creating. Bob really listened to our songs and recognized that we were less about storytelling than about singing about our own feelings and perceptions. "I'm the king of the nighttime world. I want to rock and roll all night." That was a quantum difference. "I am the god of thunder." These were the kinds of statements we specialized in, and they differentiated us from other bands. When we spoke to Bob about this, he realized that the simplicity and self-absorption in the lyrics was purposeful, that we were a band with a distinct point of view rather than just a set of guys who didn't have a clue. We wanted to write anthems, songs that felt like the theme songs for a generation, songs that had a you and me against the world perspective. As much as Paul and I loved working with Bob, Ace and Peter hated it. For the first time, they couldn't take the easy way out. Ace was not about discipline. He wouldn't even show up on time, and nobody had ever sat Peter down and said, "Here is a 2 and a 4. He has never been able to articulate his own playing. Give me a 1 and a 3 on a kick, and a 2 and a 4 on the snare. He wouldn't have a clue what that meant, and to this day he doesn't know what a 2 or a 4 is. Peter has always played by feel and couldn't play the same thing twice. As a result, Bob Ezrin's time with the band was very tough for Ace and Peter, or at least that's how they saw it. Peter, in particular, was devastated by it. He had never had any discipline. He was a street kid. Paul and I had always been critical of Ace and Peter because they didn't get the big picture, and here was this guy from the outside doing the same thing, only 10 times more intensely. Paul and I used to talk about who was taking the experience harder. In retrospect, I think both of them were feeling quite defeated, although their feelings manifested in different ways. Peter would come out furious that somebody was telling him what to play, or how to sing. and that's not rock and roll. It was the same personality that made him threaten to leave the band if we didn't include his Strange Ways solo back in '74. Ace would simply leave. Sometimes he wouldn't show up at recording sessions. On one occasion, he wanted to leave early because he had a card game at 7 that evening. At some point, Bob didn't worry about Ace or his excuses. He simply got another guitar player to come in and play Ace's parts. Mainly, he was a guy called Dick Wagner, who played with the Lou Reed Band. He was not credited, and to this day, people think it's Ace on the album. Ace felt as if Paul and I especially were traitors, and that we told Bob Ezrin to get another guitar player because we never wanted him in the band anyway. Yet we were the ones who brought him into the band, pushed him to write his own songs, and asked him to be more than a guitar player and sing his own songs. He was oblivious to that and continues to be. During the recording of Destroyer in 1975, I had another drug experience. Not an experience in which I took a drug, but the first time I ever saw cocaine cut up and ready to be snorted. A mirror was built into the control console at the recording studio, and I was clueless about its purpose. I kept on saying, "Look how stupid this is. You have to bend down to see your face. The least they could do is hang it up on the wall," and everybody would laugh. But nobody ever told me what it was for. At the time, I was using Sweet and Low in my coffee because I've always loved desserts but wanted to lose weight. One day I walked in, and there was powder on the mirror. And I was so oblivious to everything about drugs that I assumed it was Sweet and Low. I made myself some coffee, and I brushed some of the stuff on the console into my cup. Then I thought twice about it and said to myself, "That's probably got some dirt and stuff." One of the engineers explained it to me. "No, that's cocaine. You cut it up. You snort it with a straw." "That's stupid," I said. It seemed so stupid to me, in fact, that I actually took Sweet and Low and spread it on the control console. I don't know if anybody took it or not, but I thought that was a funny thing at the time. While we were recording Destroyer, we spent a lot of time in the studio, more than we ever had. During the course of those sessions, I'd be plugging one of the girls who worked there. I would say, "Excuse me, guys, I gotta go pee," and slip away to fuck her pants off. On one occasion, I snuck her into a vocal booth and laid her down. I ravenously went at her, and she at me, until she stopped, patted me on the back, and pointed to the window portal. Ezrin and the band had seen the whole thing. Paul then got the message and started doing her. We were on swing shift. After Kiss played a concert in Flint, Michigan in 1975, Peter and I were in a limousine together, and he was trying to sing something he called Beck, about a girl named Becky. I suggested that he change the name to Beth, both because it was a little easier to sing, and because it would eliminate any misunderstanding that it was about Jeff Beck. Peter brought this nice little melody into the studio and sang it for Bob. Immediately Bob sat down and fleshed it out. He had a much wider musical library than any of us. He listened to jazz, to classical, to country. He stuck in a middle eight from a Mozart piano concerto, rewrote the lyric, and suddenly we had a song. But we really didn't know what to do with it. Rock bands didn't do ballads, least of all in the midst of a concerted push for rock and roll credibility. The only way we validated the idea that there were strings on it was because of Yesterday by the Beatles. If it was cool for the Beatles, then we could do it. The first few singles from Destroyer hadn't done quite as well as we wanted. Shout It Out Loud was the first single, and it got into the top 40. Then the label released Flamin' Youth with a special picture disc, but that only got to number 74. The third single was Detroit Rock City, with Beth, this strange unclassifiable ballad on the B-side. We had high hopes for Detroit Rock City, but it didn't even chart, and the album, which had reached as high as number 11 and sold about 850,000 copies, was beginning to taper off. That's when something strange started to happen. Radio stations turned over the record and started playing Beth instead of Detroit Rock City, and it quickly became a huge hit. Beth was a breakthrough single, establishing the record. Now, rather than having a hit with a live record and then sinking back down, we were riding the crest of two massive hit records. In pop music, this has been the way to create superstars from stars. And sure enough, we were superstars. Soon after Destroyer came out, we played our first stadium, Anaheim Stadium in California, which held 55,000 fans. If it hadn't happened to us, we wouldn't have believed it. This was early 1976, only 2 years after we released our first record, and there we were playing stadiums before anyone other than the Beatles had. Bands that had been around for almost a decade, including Ted Nugent and Bob Seger, were opening for us. We knew something was going on. It was clear. The first burst of fame coincided with the first wave of Kiss merchandise. I had always seen the band as a means to an end. In my mind, making music was only part of the plan. The master plan was to create a cultural institution that was as iconic as Disney. From the very beginning, we were at the forefront of rock and roll merchandising. We had the usual products like t-shirts and posters, but we also had an interest in expanding into other markets. We grew to the point that Bill Aucoin actually bought a share in a company called Boutwell, and we wound up in manufacturing. Warehouses in the Southern California Valley were manufacturing our own t-shirts, belt buckles, and stuff. Mail order forms were enclosed inside the records. We did things other bands wouldn't have had the balls to do. The same things you see when you buy Time magazine. There's an order form inside. From the start, we didn't care that it invalidated what we did. We were not concerned with credibility. It just looked like a lot of fun. As time went on, some bands took a stand against this kind of thing. Primarily, they came from the big art rock movement in New York. We always thought they were geeks. It was as if all of a sudden the guys who never got laid in school put guitars around their necks. They didn't count for us. They didn't look like stars, they looked like students, and they always talked about stuff we couldn't care less about. Burning buildings? What are you talking about? All of a sudden, we were one of the biggest bands in the world. In the mid-'70s, a lot of the bands we grew up with were not exactly at their peak. The Stones were not. The Who were not. And we were outselling them more than 2 to 1. Bands like Queen were huge worldwide, but in America they didn't tour much. We didn't have many peers. At that time, misinformation about the band began to spread in the southern Bible Belt states, including a rumor that the name KISS stood for Knights in Satan's Service, and that the 4 of us were devil worshippers. Ironically, this rumor started as a result of an interview I gave in Circus magazine after our first album. In response to a question, I said that I sometimes wondered what human flesh tastes like. I never wanted to really find out, but I was curious intellectually. Later on, this comment seemed to ignite the whole idea that in some way KISS was aligned with devil worship. When I was asked whether I worshipped the devil, I simply refused to answer for a number of reasons. The first reason, of course, was that it was good press. Let people wonder. The second reason was my complete disregard for the people who were asking. The religious fanatics who were asking these questions didn't deserve the time of day. The uneducated always point to religious principles. Through the years, whenever religious fanatics accosted me, especially in the southern states, and quoted the Old Testament to me, I would quote them back chapter and verse. They didn't know that I had been a theology major in school. An idiot is an idiot, whether he quotes the Bible or not. Fueling the fire for the Satan-worshipping nonsense was my hand signal, which involved the pinky, the thumb, and the index finger. This started innocently enough during concerts. I'd hold the pick with my thumb and my 2 middle fingers. Some people mistakenly thought it was a gesture of some kind, so they started waving their index and pinky fingers toward me in return. The second part of the hand signal came from my love of Spider-Man. In the comics, he sometimes had his middle finger pressed against the inside of his palm. I copied that in an early photo, and the fundamentalists seized on it. In point of fact, the hand signal actually means I love you in sign language, though I didn't know that at the time. This hand signal, ironically enough, became a standard gesture for other heavy metal bands and their fans, and it has been in constant circulation ever since. I was getting the hang of handling magazine reporters. A Rolling Stone writer wanted to do a story on the band. He came up to a duplex I was renting on Riverside Drive in New York to interview me for what he said would be a cover story. When I met him, I was very careful to cultivate the demon mystique. I wore all my spider and silver jewelry and my leather pants. I puffed up my hair as big as it would go, with my 7-inch platform boots with silver dollar signs on them and black nail polish. I thought I was ready to project a perfect badass rock and roll image. He was right there with me through this entire interview. Then at one point the door buzzer sounded, I answered it, and in the doorway was my mother with enough food to feed the world. Fresh hot soups, veal cutlets, pancakes, jams, cakes. She insisted that he and I think she called us hungry boys, stop what we were doing and eat. She kept calling me by my Hebrew name, Chaim, and told the writer I was a good boy. The big bad demon was just a mama's boy. Being a mama's boy, though, has never kept me from chasing the ladies. I bedded down one girl after another. There was no end to them. They were in every hotel room, every backstage area, every limousine. At one point, I found out that the Carpenters were staying in the same hotel. I called Karen Carpenter, who was staying a few floors below me, and left my female guest in my room to go down there with the idea of seducing her. Karen was certainly playful enough on the phone with me, very giggly, very friendly, and very suggestive. And when I walked in on what I thought was going to be an evening of seduction, it became something else. Karen was a sweet, frail girl. She still looked fairly healthy, not as gaunt as she would later become from anorexia. I spent most of the early evening talking with her about all kinds of things. Mostly she was fascinated and curious about my bed-hopping lifestyle. She didn't understand it. Although she did admit that lust is a strong urge, and she agreed that men were susceptible to the powers of lust, she was nonetheless convinced that I didn't actually want to do what I wanted to do, but was actually doing it to avoid intimacy. And she said all of this in a very non-judgmental way. At the end of the conversation, I said, "Well, it was nice talking to you. I gotta go." She wanted to know where I was going. I said I had left a girl upstairs and I would have to go and keep her company. Karen was flabbergasted that the girl would wait for me and simply not leave. I thought it was bizarre that she would even ask me that. Where I had initially walked down with seduction on my mind, the truth is sex was the last thing that either one of us wanted from the other that night. Maybe because of that, the experience has remained in my mind all these years. Our lifestyle changed drastically after Destroyer, especially after the boost from Beth. I bought houses for both my parents, even though I hadn't seen my father since he left me as a child in Israel. Paul did likewise for his folks. But Ace and Peter lived at the edge. They bought many cars and lived in many houses. At one point, Ace built a home recording studio with poured concrete, then found he couldn't use it because his neighborhood wasn't zoned for it. Between them, they cracked up or crashed at least 10 cars. Mercedes, DeLoreans, you name it. The funniest one was Peter crashing in his garage. The fire department had to come in with the jaws of life to get him out of his car in his own garage. Another part of our lifestyle changed too. As I have said, we always had plenty of women on the road, but now we had the means to treat them like queens. And that caused problems in our personal relationships. There are some hilarious stories about Peter. I had a liaison with a girl, and then Peter fell for her. They saw each other for a little while, and then Peter brought her phone number back home. His wife was a jealous woman and was brighter than Peter. So he hid the phone number under the stereo. His wife was cleaning one day, and she actually lifted up the stereo and found the number. So she called up this girl and said, "Hello, this is Oregon Health Department. Are you so-and-so?" The woman said, "Yes, why are you calling me?" "Well, we just need to find out if you're familiar with a Peter Criscola, who is otherwise known as Peter Criss, drummer in Kiss." "Yes?" "Well," Peter's wife said, "he may have the clap. We're trying to ascertain what period of time you may have had physical contact because you may need to get a checkup. Can you tell us the specifics?" At this, the woman came clean with the specifics. It was this time of night, in this Holiday Inn. "Thank you very much," Peter's wife said and hung up. When he came home, she had him pinned. "Peter, where were you at 7:30 at night on Monday? Were you with so-and-so?" She had him dead to rights. In May 1976, we sold out Madison Square Garden for 3 nights in a row. This was a big deal for us. When we were starting out, the 4 of us used to sit in our loft at 10 East 23rd Street and say that we had only 10 blocks to go to reach Madison Square Garden, which is on 33rd Street. And now, we were there. CBS News had a broadcaster named Kaidi Tong. She was one of their big stars then. The cameras were all over us, and she kept asking me questions about the experience, less about rock and roll and more about the freak show aspect of our lives. "You guys look so weird. And you are the guy who sticks his tongue out. How long is it anyway?" I was close to 7 feet tall in the outfit, and she must have been about 5'2". Her arm was stretched way up into the air to hold the microphone near my mouth. While she was interviewing me, with the cameras all around me, I felt something in back of me. I turned around and my mom, all 5'4" of her, was trying to fix something, to make it look right. I was wearing a thin strip of leather with studs around it, and it ran right through the crack of my butt and connected to a codpiece covered with spikes, and my mother was trying to brush off a piece of lint, or clean a spot, or something. It was like trying to walk up in back of a tank and take off a piece of thread. By this time, my mother had remarried. Her new husband was a man named Eli, a Polish gentleman, who had lost some family in the war. He worked in the clothing business, and he worshipped my mother. If they were walking down the street and she saw a piece of clothing she liked in a window, he would study it intently and then make an exact replica for her. The timing of the remarriage was good, because it allowed me to get on with my life. When I was younger, it was just the 2 of us, my mother and me. And at that time, I probably would have had difficulty dealing with a remarriage. When Eli came along, though, I was already out of the house, at college, and ready to be on my own. Eli and my mother didn't really understand the band project. I had this pact with my mother. If my music career didn't work out, I would fall back on teaching. That seemed to satisfy her, but beyond that, it was all a mystery to them. I don't remember talking to either of them very much at that time. I was so busy trying to build up the band, although I do recall having conversations with Eli about politics. I was a young man, more liberal and more accepting of differences, He was less liberal. One of the things I came to understand was that when you had seen what he had seen, when you had witnessed your family murdered by people supposedly representing your government, you didn't necessarily believe in liberal politics.